Welcome to Tribesy Talk. I'm Rena Doyle, co-founder of Tribesy.
I'm Gail Watts, the other co-founder.
I'm Jamal Kadwarate, a consultant with Tribesy.
And so welcome to another episode where we are going to talk about the upcoming holidays.
Yeah.
As we have the holidays coming up, one of the things that we experience with our clients on a personal level is how do I basically stand being in the room with some of my family members during particularly Thanksgiving and Christmas. So my question for you two is, do you all celebrate Thanksgiving? What does that look like? And is there any anxiety involved in these holidays with your family?
I will say absolutely lots of anxiety. We celebrate a lot of the holidays, so I tend to get together with family, I tend to get together with friends, lots of Friendsgiving gatherings, and lots happen in December. So between Hanukkah, between Christmas, and Kwanzaa, lots of gatherings with different people.
Same here. A lot of family members have holiday parties, and so there's always a family event to be going to sometime between mid-November and the beginning of January.
So how does that look for you all? Give us an insight into how that looks. What conversations? Are there games? Are there certain people that you don't want to invite that you're forced to invite? Tell me what that looks like.
There's food.
Always
which,
food.
Is the highlight and the center of it all. We're not like gaming people. We tend to dance, talk a lot. But invariably in the talking, there's debates.
Yeah, same here. Not so much games. Usually it's a time for people to sit and chat and eat, because in some cases we may not have seen each other that often recently, and so it's really an opportunity to just reconnect.
So in my family, I'm a first generation American. My parents are immigrants. The notion of Thanksgiving and what it was about was foreign. However, the behavior in Thanksgiving is not foreign at all, of getting together, of cooking together, of enjoying together. And my family loves sports. So sports being part of Thanksgiving is all very familial, even though we didn't have something called Thanksgiving where they're from. So I think I personally have always had good experiences with Thanksgiving because our family, it was just another gathering that we're used to doing throughout the year. So my family's from Trinidad and Tobago, and they have that country has the most holidays I've ever heard of. They have like 20-something holidays, and it's all an excuse to get together, party, dance, enjoy one another, and things like that. So Thanksgiving isn't a far cry from all of those other activities. I know for sure we never have conversations about indigenous people or the purpose of Thanksgiving. It just isn't a conversation at all because the behavior was way more important than the impetus of the holiday, right? So I personally don't have anxiety around it other than shopping and cooking and all those things. I don't. And as my family has grown to extended and bonus family members coming, some of the conversations could end up in a dialogue, but it's rarely a debate. It's rarely a debate about some things. Now, the only topic that I think, two topics that ever get debate is male versus female behavior and outside of the country versus American behavior, right? There tends to be a little bit of some debate and data on that. But other than that, we just tend to have a good time. So is that different from what you
Yes,
all experienced?
yes.
Okay. Tell me about that.
It depends upon which side of my family you're talking about. So the family I grew up in was very much into debate. Debate was encouraged, and it was always, somebody against somebody else, and a lot of topics that people may consider taboo that you're not supposed to talk about were common household topics and common family get-together topics. Politics, religion, those were big topics, and it was always a debate. There was never a dialogue. And certainly nobody ever won the debate, but it just seemed to be the practice of engaging in a debate, which was sometimes frustrating. On the other side of my family, it's very different. A lot of those topics are just either touched on very superficially or avoided. Right? And so it tends to be more personal conversations, and there's almost an intention of avoiding the topics of the day that could be seen as problematic.
My family is very into debates. We never win. Nobody ever wins. People just get deeper into their own positions, more fixed and entrenched beliefs, and it gets ugly, to be very honest. Like, temperatures rise, and we, aren't always as kind to each other as we could be. But yes, I'm also an immigrant, and so immigrant family, and we have to learn about Thanksgiving. So that's where it actually starts for me and my family in the debate. So my chosen family and my birth family don't necessarily see Thanksgiving the same. So a lot of my chosen family talk about what Thanksgiving means to Indigenous people, and talks about, like, what are we really celebrating with this holiday, and that just conflicts right away with my family that came here and adopted a lot of the U.S. dominant norms around Thanksgiving is cheery, and we love the turkeys and everybody's smiling. I'm like, really, everybody? Not quite, right? So that's part of where it starts, knowing that, like, some of the people in my chosen family are making choices about how much to bring their views of Thanksgiving to the table.
Right.
And then we put all the other topics on the table too. We talk about politics. Everybody thinks they're an expert on what's happening.
Right.
And we talk about world events. I have a lot of people in my family who are up on news, and we just have different political views.
So it seems to me that in every family there's like a pocket of people who start to get together and talk about news because they're news junkies, right? Yes. And those who aren't news junkies may sprinkle salt and pepper their views here and there, but don't end up so much in the debate because they're not in the news junkies. And there's nothing against people who watch the news a lot, but of course it influences what they want to talk about. And so it'd be interesting if, I think, families said, look, instead of trying to fight this, right? Because what we often hear is people say, we're going to come together and we can't talk about this, or we can't, obviously we don't have the skills, we don't want an argument, we don't want people exhausted, so they block it off, right? So I think an interesting concept would be to have people watch news, since they like to watch news and they like to talk about that. Don't take it away from them, right? And we know they don't have much of the skills, but maybe assign them to watch news from a different country, right? With the internet these days, to get some other perspectives on maybe some of the same, right? Because one of the problems is our news is very skewed, right? And it's not skewed just for an American view, it's skewed for subdivisions of American culture, right? So it might be interesting to ask these folks, we're gonna have these conversations. Maybe you can look at it from, pick a country on the globe and try to watch the news from that perspective, and maybe have those conversations from multiple perspectives instead of us having conversations from our holes, right? Because you talked about being entrenched. We sometimes end up, it's like being inside of a hole and you're shooting out your views, and nothing else comes in, right, to this hole. So That might be an interesting way to deal about it. We do have conversation about news because of the news junkies in my families as well. It just doesn't really turn into a debate. It usually turns into something bad about the United States, but which everybody can agree to, I guess. But it doesn't turn into usually huge debates. Although I am afraid a little bit for this coming year. Because of the huge conversation about Israel and Palestine. And then we have an upcoming election, which all of that is going to feed into that. So I'm a little worried about that. So I'm wondering what you all think might help in some of your families, things that you could do to encourage, because you want to encourage, right? Conversation like this. But you don't want it to end up where people are exhausted or mad at one another.
Well, there are a couple of thoughts. So as I said, one component of my family is very much debate centered, right? And it's again about entrenching your point of view, and you need to hear my point of view. But another part of the family is very much let's not talk about it, because we don't want to have an argument. It's almost like there is a fear of having different points of view. And so, like, if we have different points of view, then we automatically have conflict, and that's going to damage our relationships. And so I think there's a different approach for both. So in that, recognizing it's okay, we're humans. We have, different points of view. It's nice to be able to have a conversation where the purpose of the conversation is to explore why we have different points of view. Where does that come from? Not that you're right or I'm wrong. There's no winner, there's no loser, but I just really like to know where that comes from and what experiences in your life has shaped your perspective. Where do you get your perspective from? Again, for the news junkies, are they getting, it's just a particular, news, that they follow? Have they considered another point of view? But just to explore that. For the other side of the family, who are very much debate-centered, it needs to be some thought about how do we engage in, again, the same thing, where we're exploring without having to, it doesn't have to come down to an accusation, right? There is going to be no winner or loser, and it doesn't have to be accusation-based. Again, it's about how do we explore our differences in a place that it's not about whether we're good people or bad people.
I was thinking about the suggestion of watching news from different countries and just thinking like, how would my family feel about that? How willing are they to do that? Because part of what I notice is things are happening really fast.
Yeah.
Right? It's like rapid fire comments and accusations and these grand statements about the world, about how things are.
Right.
And so there isn't a lot, we are not in the practice of slowing down, becoming informed, having curiosity about each other's perspectives. It's just not what we have done as a family. And I think that's part of the anxiety for me going to family gatherings, is that these are the people that I have the most baggage with.
Right.
These are the people who I have strongest patterns with. And so for me, breaking out of those patterns feels like a win. Not getting sucked into that rapid fire back and forth, and like finding another way to open up the conversation, ask people to reflect on how they got there, why they're saying that, what's the basis and the information, what are your sources, without asking them to cite them, but like just inquiring, how did you develop your perspective? And I think also there's some norms in the family that can be difficult to navigate if I have a perspective that's more on the margins. And that's also true. My chosen family, not always having the same identities as some of my family. And so there's this really interesting thing we're navigating around not just having intense, rapid fire conversations, but knowing that there's a lot of dominant thinking, a lot of dominant norms at play. And I try to use my skills to navigate that, but it's hard.
Yeah. So I think that the key element here is the emotion that comes with it. Gail and I often talk about how we have really great skills with strangers and with people who think very
Right.
differently from us.
Right.
And then we get into an argument with our significant others, and it
all goes out the window.
Out the window,
Yeah.
because there
It's
is emotion, and you talked about baggage and that type of thing. And I think one of the first things we need to do is transform our thinking about family gatherings, right? And it'll start with us and viewers. And so one of the transformative thinking is that this is not a bad thing to have conversation with your family, right? So we start transforming it there. There are things that people say that I don't agree with or whatever, but it's good to have family members around, simply because, as I have experienced recently, you don't know when they're not going to be at the next gathering.
Right.
So we transform it that might be really helpful. I think in dealing with my family in particular, it's been interesting to hear. So one of the dynamics in my family is age, right? And so how much do I challenge that cousin who is 1 year older than me? How much do I challenge that? And it's a deep socialization within at least my generation and older. And how do I challenge without being disrespectful? And how do I challenge without hurting that person's feelings? Because I do love this person. And so that is definitely a skill. And I think that people need to think about this as a skill. Dealing with your family is a skill. Also, if you haven't taken the time to know your family members as individuals, which I have to remind myself of, because we're so much alike in my family. We are very much alike, but we do have differences, and we have differences because of the experiences that we've had. I'm also very surprised at the experiences that I think are just mine, and I hear another cousin say the same experience. So the other thing we have to accept is that your family are also made up of individuals with different experiences, and that might also help to temper what you're saying. That they're not personally attacking you. They just may not understand you or where you come from, and they may not understand how different you are as a person, or you may not understand how different they are as a person, because they've had different experiences just because they're your family. So I think that also, because we hear all the time, how can someone who grew up in the same house feel so differently,
and
the
vote
same
differently,
parents,
yes.
and the same, I mean, the psychological shock that happens when you have a family member that feels differently from you is unlike any other shock for some reason.
Right.
That person is also an individual
with different experiences
Right.
that have shaped who they are. And I think part of what's really important is you were talking about, you have this rapid fire, right? How do you break a pattern, right? If you are the only one coming to the gathering saying, I intentionally want to engage with my family in a different way, but how do I break that pattern of this is how we have a conversation, or these are the topics we completely avoid, or this is how conversation gets shut down? And I think sometimes you almost have to say, and name it up front, look, I'd really like to have a conversation about some of the things that are happening in the world, but I'd like to do it differently than we've had it in the past.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if the application will go over so well.
I mean, it may not be suitable for every family
Right,
member or every situation, but
right.
it might be something you can try with some folks.
Yeah, I think it's like pulling on all the strategies, knowing
Right,
what
right.
your family's like, knowing
Right.
how they respond, knowing who you are. And so if it works
Yeah.
to say explicitly, I'd like to do this differently, that's a strategy. I know my family would be like, okay,
Not
whatever, they would just dismiss and move forward and keep doing what they do. I find what works in my family is just consistent interruption of what I perceive as offensive sometimes just straight hateful jokes and statements, that are normalized. We don't think of ourselves as bad people, and I don't think we're bad people, but I think some of the views that we've come to hold and to share casually are rooted in homophobia.
Right.
Are rooted in the belief that some religions are better than others.
Yeah.
Like we just have these ways of talking casually, and so my interruption sometimes is like, I just don't agree with that. Like basing it in I statements,
Right.
and really just saying directly like I have a different point of view. Like the way I see it is this. Or like saying a joke that counters their joke. I pull on those strategies sometimes, and I find them kind of effective. I'm still trying to find out what works with my family, to be honest. But I do really relate with what you were saying about the time together is precious.
Yes.
And none of us knows what's going to happen next week or the next year, what's going to happen Thanksgiving next year, who's going to be around and who isn't. And so I find it really helpful to go in with that intention of appreciating this is family, for better or worse, and I want to find ways to connect. I want to find ways for us to celebrate and revel together, and then wrestle in the ways that we can. And so I find that the strategies for me start before I get to the gathering. They're in the ways I set my own intentions. I remind myself who I get, I have issues with this word, but triggered by, who pushes my buttons, and to just prepare myself to have a little bit more compassion, a little bit more patience.
So I'm wondering what you all do, because at family gatherings, you tend to have multi-generational experiences, right? And so there's always young people, and they're listening. They pay attention to what, people in the family are saying. They're also hearing what's not being said.
That's not always the experience of my family.
Okay.
Because young people are not allowed to commingle with older people during certain conversations.
Okay.
So that doesn't mean they don't notice the social behavior with one another. But these type of conversations we're having, you will get dismissed
from
out of the room if you are younger. So I'm not sure where you were heading with that, but when you said in all families young people are listening, in my family they're not.
Well, I'm wondering what they could be listening from another room. No,
because
they're completely out.
So what happens is you end up with, and this just happened at a family gathering for a funeral. The generations find their own corners of the house eventually. They do commingle, but you'll allow my mother's generation for them to have their conversations. And then my generation will get together, and then my son's generations will get together. And I can tell you in what rooms recently they were just in. Now, does that mean that we don't commingle? Yes, we do. We absolutely move around and things like that. But there's a core group that, I knew when they asked me for my son, I knew where to take the video call, where to do it. So we end up in separate areas, still having these conversations that we're talking about in our generational levels.
So then I'm wondering,
because it's kind of frustrating to have it intergenerationally.
Yeah, because that was going to be my question is at least in terms of my experience, that you'll have some members of the family who share hateful things, and a young person is listening. And what do you do in those situations? Because that's either the message they're hearing, or if they hear silence, in other words, that there are so many topics you're not allowed to talk about. They know that there are wars happening. They know that there's a lot happening in the world, yet it's not talked about. And that has an impact too. So I was just wondering about how you all dealt with that in your families.
So I'll just say for me, we do commingle and have those certain conversations at age appropriateness. And you know when to excuse yourself, when not to excuse yourself, else you'll be excused. But so we had conversations about the economy of not only Trinidad recently, but the United States, and how wages aren't meeting, living expenses and things like that. And we had the same conversation, drew parallels and things like that. And so we had that intergenerationally. That conversation was intergenerationally. I can't say that the very, very young were part of that conversation and would know to leave, but we are able to have that. And there are some generational differences about where to go in the future. Are we going in the right direction? Things like that. There seems to be some agreements that we can have, though, because we've had the life experiences to find some agreement. But I can't say we ever have a debate. We're not. It's just the culture. We're not looking to win in these conversations. We're on the same side. We're in the same family. We're not looking to win, but we do explore multiple. And you'll hear someone say, "No, that's not." That type of thing. But there isn't an attack. I don't think I've ever felt an attack. But the young people do. We used to have our own conversations, age appropriate conversations that were usually nothing to do with the world. But there's also something that's in my family that I think is in a lot of different families, is that when we get together, we haven't seen each other in a long time.
Right.
And because we have oceans between us and things like that, we're so busy just catching up on each other's life that it's hard to envision talking about the rest of the world until all of that happens first, right? And then we can talk about the world. But for most of the time, we are just catching up, or we're venting, or we're with one another first. So our gatherings tend to be a place of release and fun and that type of thing, because you finally have someone you can talk to that gets it. I know, like for me, I don't have to do a bunch of explaining for things of why I feel this way. I could say a couple of words and my cousin goes, I get it, this da-da-da-da-da. So there's a release of having to explain things all the time.
Yeah, I relate to the release, the reconnecting, having a whole bunch of fun. And it's interesting, as you were talking about catching up, what came to mind is how it's in the catch up that so often these things get slipped in. Why is that person not married yet?
Yeah.
All the layers of expectation around gender, around sexuality, the ways that suspicions are raised. So the catch up is a place where we teach the young people some of the stereotypes, and they were taught to me. So I talked about baggage earlier with my family, but I just am at a more aware place in my life of how these are the people who taught me the stereotypes I held.
And
they're still teaching them to the grandbabies, right? So I think there's this desire within me to not only model something different for the young people, but also challenge the older people with as much respect as I can, because I do come from a culture with respect, where respect is everything.
You gotta do.
And sometimes I don't do it.
Yeah,
sometimes I
don't. I never break that.
And I'll say things like, I don't mean any disrespect, but what you're saying is really messed up in my view. To me, I can't accept what you're saying on a really concrete level around the issue of Palestine and Israel. I had a family member say, well, the way history works is you have to have a few million people die before a real change happens. And that hit me so hard, because I don't believe that millions of people have to die.
I think they were saying factually, that's a true statement, but it doesn't have to.
It doesn't have to. I think these are the conflicts we have, right? Where it's world history tells us that this is how it has to be. And I'm coming from, we are human beings
to break those
with the power to do something different.
Right. I think there's a way of acknowledging, just using that example, that is a true statement, right? Unfortunately, that's a true statement. The root of a problem, if you only deal with it from your lifespan,
Right.
on almost every human thing,
Right.
but no matter what it is.
And if you only deal with it because of the moment when it affects you. Right. When it's like, oh, my group is being persecuted or targeted for violence, and that's when my outrage shows up.
Right.
And when it happens to everybody else, I'm like, well, that's their problem.
And that's
this is
a
what history
huge problem
does.
right now.
Yeah.
Right? That's a huge problem right now in the conversation around Israel and Palestine. And I think that's going to cause conflict in families. If you're talking at the voice of history, but people are only talking of the voice of today. First of all, just getting to some recommendations we may have is understanding that you all may not be speaking the same language.
Mm-hmm.
So you're speaking in English, but if you're speaking history and this person is exclusively speaking today, you're not speaking the same language. Mm-hmm. You are absolutely not speaking the same language. And so there has to be a way of saying, let's talk about the history first. Do you know the history? Mm-hmm. And it may be that no one is educated in that room enough. They may not either identify with the groups, or they just, because our education system doesn't do a good job of teaching us about other groups.
And the media too, like you
The
said.
media doesn't do a good job of it. So, do you know the history? And isn't our history, your history, important to today?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And making that connection to today. And it's almost impossible to have, I remember the war in Eastern Europe with
Bosnia.
Mm-hmm. And I remember feeling a strong way when that happened. And I started, looking up the history, and I said, oh.
This didn't just pop off.
Well, not only that it's old, but it was absolutely the flip of the people I was feeling bad for. They were absolutely the aggressors for a very long time. And I am siding with the aggressors because they happen to be victims in my lifetime, right? So it's really difficult to have these long conflicts in a vacuum. And I feel like some family members are frustrated by the vacuum conversation.
I know I am.
Right? And so I don't know if we bring out a vacuum in the middle of it. Okay, you guys, we're in a Hoover conversation
It's the symbol
here,
But
right?
that then it also goes back to where people get their information from. So often people will say that they think they know the history, but they don't analyze or question the gaps in their own understanding, or where their information comes from, or whose history, from whose perspective that they're learning about the history of a particular conflict or a place in the world.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also stuck on the word you said, the side. Like, what side am I on,
Yes.
right? Because I think that's the other trap
Yep.
that
Yes.
we
Yes.
fall into.
Yes.
That we have to pick a side, that there's only one right side.
That's correct.
And
Yes.
I think we lose our capacity or skills to hold multiple points of view. And I think that the more we settle on to, I'm just gonna pick which side and defend them at all costs, or regardless of what other information I hear, the less likely we are to hold people's humanity.
You're right. I do get a visceral reaction with that word side,
Yes.
right? Because I also think it stops us from being able to have empathy for one another. And my experience, so the whole history behind the Rwanda extermination is very emotional for me, and I do not identify as Rwandan that I know of, because colonialization is horrid, that I know of. And so it is emotional for me because of the ways that colonization has the ability to capture the minds of people and make them not like themselves. When we talk, if I was to enter in a conversation where someone used the term tribalism, when it comes to Rwanda, that would have an effect on me, a negative effect on me, because the fact that it's couched as tribalism came from the people who created the problem in the first place, right? And so if you don't have that knowledge about the impetus of this extermination and how it was years long of campaign to do this to these people, then it's difficult for you to have that conversation. You're going to always look at it as, look what these people did to each other. You're never going to have a different view of that. And when I actually went to Rwanda and actually heard Rwandans tell their story, which I had never in my lifetime experienced, except for one Rwandan, but I didn't take that as the Rwandan experience. It dawned on me how much words are used to make me as an American feel some kind of way about conflicts in other countries, right? And it's sickening. It's almost sickening to know that I had no idea the level of manipulation and malicious, murderous intent of colonizers in that country. That's probably as clean as I could make it for this conversation. So I guess I'm saying with your families that say stuff, if I was with a family member that said, "Oh, look at what those black folks in Rwanda did to one another," I would go, "Come again?" Right? It would probably end up in some kind of debate because I've taken the time to hear from Rwandans. But the skill is to say, have you ever spoken to a Rwandan about it? Have you been to Rwanda? No, but then that's it.
You got some research to do.
That is really the end of what you can say. You have an opinion and a perception, but realize that opinion and perception is based on something else other than the people who lived it.
Right.
And we also have to be aware that the media that we're exposed to is shaping this conversation. As you were saying, it's creating, you're either with me or against me. Which side are you on? In Israel and Palestine, you're either on this side or you're on that side. And it doesn't allow us to have a nuanced conversation. It doesn't allow us to then explore what is it we don't know about the history, right? I realized there was a whole lot I didn't know about the history of the region and the impact of colonization and what that looked like, the influence of the British, and how an entire region was divided up not by the people who were there.
Can we just talk about the first time I saw England on a map? I was like, this little place has all these problems in the world. It's like a little tiny, it's not even part of Europe. It's like some island. No offense to any of our English viewers, but it's a little tiny place that caused global problems. All right, that was just a side joke.
I'll circle back to what you said about you would have a visceral or strong reaction to some things. In terms of strategies, that's something for me. Recognizing what is it that I have a strong reaction to, paying attention to where do I feel it in my body.
Yeah.
Like I can feel my jaw tense up.
Oh, really?
Like this is probably too much information, but I grind my teeth at night, but it's all stress related. And I do it in the day as well when I'm in those tense moments. So getting better at recognizing like, ooh, like this is escalating within me, right? And then doing that check-in about, okay, what are the questions, right? How can I ask, what do you know? What's your source of information? And I love how you said like, that's it, right? Because that's a strategy for me, knowing when this conversation is not constructive, right?
Yeah.
Like it could go on for a long time, and that is my family pattern. That we'll talk about something for an hour.
Right.
Everybody's just partially informed, but really strong in their
opinions.
positions.
Yeah.
And it's like circular, it's accusatory, it's not going anywhere.
Right.
So one of the strategies for me is to recognize like, you know what, I don't actually want to continue this conversation.
Yeah.
Like
the only
research.
thing I would add to your strategy is one of the things that Gail and I really talk about is so you did the reflection of having a strong reaction, how do you feel it? We've also been telling people to announce that,
Yeah.
right? So even in our sessions, someone will say something and one of us will go, I just had a really strong reaction to what you said. And then we explain why.
Right.
And the why isn't because I feel you were trying to somehow cause that in me, or you woke up this morning chosen violence against me personally, right? That's not it. It's just when we speak, we don't know what someone else has been through and what visceral reactions, cultural, experiential, whatever, we will give folks. And so I think it's helpful sometimes. We found it helpful when you announce that to folks. We find that people even listen even more.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, I didn't mean to do that to you, but I want to hear more about the why.
Right.
It's almost less than important that you had this reaction, and they want to know why you had that reaction.
It also gives you
and
a
it
moment.
does have a positive influence on the conversation.
Yeah, it also gives you a moment, right? Because you put it out there, and sometimes you just need a moment because you're having that visceral reaction, and people will give you that grace lots of times, we've noticed. So
Yeah. And it's good to say why. The why may be obvious to you.
Right.
This is the work you do. This is whom you're married to. This is whom is in your family. Of course, I am offended by what you just said. But you have to explain that to people.
Yeah.
You have to say, I had a very visceral reaction because I had this experience or whatever. So just adding on to what you say, I would help the other person understand the reaction they're about to get from you because of what they said.
Yeah, I love that. And I love also in the why, explaining not only how I feel or why I got to my own perspectives on an issue or how I got there. I also like including in the why something about the relationship. You know, that I, especially with family,
Right.
you know, I really want to make sure we can have a good time. We're here for a few days. I want to make sure we don't end up, you know, sitting in our different corners, because that has happened in my family. We've had blow-ups, and then it's like a day before people can circle back and actually have conversations. You know, so I've referenced that, you know, to them. I've been like, you remember what happened that that time? I want to make sure we don't get there.
Yeah.
You know, I want to make sure we don't rupture something in our time together.
Right, right. And that's where you may find out about how people value a relationship with you as well.
Yeah.
Because you may have that value and the person you're talking to doesn't share that value with you, and you're going to have to eat that, right? So just know that, you know, part of what you're saying is a vulnerability to you. You may find out that my cousin doesn't love me like I love that cousin. And that's just gonna be fair game in this. You're just gonna be like, well, that's what it is, right?
So that kind of leads me to then thinking about, you know, right now there's all the conversation about cancel culture, right? People are sometimes quick or maybe not quick to eliminate somebody from their lives because they have a very different perspective. So I was wondering how you all feel about that. I mean, granted, there is a point at which another human being in your life could be toxic.
Yeah.
And certainly every person has to evaluate what that looks like for them, whether it's a family member or not. You know, is that toxic? Is that beyond repair? But, you know, just wondering what you think about this idea of just, you know, you voted differently than me, so you're canceled. Because that's another thing that comes up when in family gatherings, right?
Well, again, I think
Maybe not so much in yours.
Well, no, I think the dynamics in a family are important. So just reflecting on a friend who called me the other night who had not spoken to his sister for years because of the whole conversation around Trump. That Trump had successfully separated a brother and sister that they, to the point where they could not speak to one another. And years later, let's fast forward 3-4 years later, my friend is the older brother, reached out and said, hey, just want you to know via text, I love you. Your brother misses you. I love you. There was no response. A few days later, tried it again. Hey, just want to let you know, I miss you. Love talking to you again. No response. Person did it again. no response. And then a few days later, got a response, your sister misses you too. And so that was followed up by a conversation that went for hours, reminiscing, talking about how they care about one another, not talking about why they split, because that wasn't a priority. The priority was talking about how much they loved one another. 4 days later, the sister passed away unexpectedly. So for that person, that relationship mattered. And because it really mattered, there was an extension. There was a what I call the arm out to dance, right? I'm not requiring you to talk to me, but I'm going to extend the invitation to come have this dance with me, right? And so I think it really depends on. My friend did not feel that the sister was toxic for their whole life, that their sister was blah blah blah. And so wanted to try to reach out, and also anticipated that some years had gone by and that any human can see things differently over a couple of years, and wanted to check in, and maybe things are different for the sister, which it seemed like things were a little bit different for the sister at that time in that moment. And so what that tells me is we are always assessing not only what's good for us, but what's good for overall. And if someone is very toxic in your life and their family, and they can destroy family gatherings and members and things like that, yes, you may have to shut them off. How long, and it will be up to you in those dynamics. So I don't want to put time limits on it. But you may have to create boundaries where people obviously don't understand boundaries, and those boundaries are important to the success of a relationship. I do want to say, however, you have to assess that.
Right? Absolutely.
And you have to assess how much is this person just talking, or is this person truly in their heart, right? Love me. And then we have all other dynamics. We have mental illness as a dynamic. You have, and I don't mean just like your crazy aunt or uncle. No, I'm talking about real mental illness plays in these dynamics as well. And we may not want to face that in some of our families. So it's, I don't want to make a very complicated situation a simple answer. However, I think if you love that person, take the time out to do that. Take the time out to do that assessment, right?
And maybe leave a window open at some point in time.
And maybe leave a window open at some point in time, maybe.
Maybe twice. Maybe at the beginning and the end of that sentence.
Right.
I think of a spectrum of, on one end, there's people in our lives who have been incredibly damaging or toxic or abusive. And I think it's everybody's right to not go back to an abuser. On the other end of the spectrum, I think we have people who are really into canceling at the slightest thing.
Right.
And there isn't a lot of room for disagreement. There isn't a lot of room for just differences. And there's this treating of people like they're expendable. And so I feel like those are two ends of the spectrum, and in between there's just so much room for us to figure out, what do I have capacity for? You know, not only around mental illness, but just mental health, right? That my well-being is important. And I know whether it's family or strangers or coworkers, all of that can, relationships with those people can impact our mental health. So I think it's also about the check-in with oneself, what is my capacity? What is it that feels too much for me right now? You know, whether that's I got some bad news, I'm dealing with some health things, I'm tired, right? Whatever is happening, I feel like that check-in to see what is my capacity, how much can I extend and be with somebody who is either saying things or doing behaviors that I find challenging, right? I'm a proponent of figuring out how much we can extend that arm and reach out to people and connect.
Yeah.
So that's where I land with it, but I know it's always that individual check-in It's always that context that I think determines it. And I think of Audre Lorde a lot, but also in this moment around self-care is not self-indulgent.
Right.
It is self-preservation.
It
is.
And so if self-preservation looks like strong boundaries, I'm for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was also thinking about, certainly I've had some folks in my life, a couple, where I had to put in a firm boundary. They, because behaviors were really, really problematic. And then there are other folks that have, just sort of drifted away just because.
Mm-hmm.
And allowing for adults to grow and evolve, right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking to add to this.
Yeah, because then being able to reconnect, because quite frankly, a lot has happened in our society in the past number of years, and you may find that people are in a very different place. They may be open, and at least that's found that in some of my relationships that have kind of let slide for a while, and now there's an opening for that because there's been some changes in perspective and experiences that allow us to have a deeper conversation and reconnect in a different way. So
I'm just going to say it doesn't apply to everybody. Nothing
Right.
we are saying applies
Right.
to everybody,
Right.
period.
Humans.
Right? It just doesn't. Some people are not going to change. Some people do change. And it's sometimes you have the complication of a human, it changes in this category, but is not moving in another category, right? So, we hope, here at Tribesy, we hope that you have a wonderful holiday with your family and that you start with you before you face your family, that you don't build your anxiety up before you have an opportunity to get with your family, that you remember that there may not be another holiday with this family member as well, and to keep that in mind. And to also remember you're probably somewhat on the same side, even though you can be different as family members. So we want to wish you all some happy conversations. Doesn't mean it won't be challenging. It's okay for it to be challenging, but we want to wish you wonderful holidays with your family. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you again for the next episode of Tribesy Talk.